On behalf of the Farmington Hills Call to Action Coalition, a community-based organization dedicated to breaking the silence on drug abuse, addiction, and violence issues, this program, made possible due to the continuing support of the Farmington Hills Police Department and their drug forfeiture monies, is dedicated to those lives altered, shattered, or lost due to domestic violence, or what some refer to as relationship violence. As you begin to watch this program, I wish you to sense the pain and chaos from an anonymous survivor's heart. This survivor speaks to you through her writing, which paints the pain of abuse with words of color and poignancy. She states to you that the pain of abuse seeks solace, and solace can only be regained through validation. She begins by saying that no matter what you do, you can't get out of the pain. You can't escape it. You have to walk through it in order to recover. No day passed without her soul aching. No day was without her soul shedding tears for what was and for what is. Only the very essence of time lessened the wounds, but the scars remain hauntingly. She had learned to lie still in fear of stairwells that beckoned upheaval. The shattering of peaceful climbs rested upon his anger. He was always watching. His eyes defiled calm. It was late. Her mind reeled with frustration, but the conflict within was beginning to tire her. She gazed at the rain beating against the window, and she could not seem to ease the ache that burned within her soul and forged a hole within her heart. In the midst of despair, she wept, silent tears, leaving only today fertile with abuse, but alas, barren of yesterday's hope. All families have dysfunction, but we survive dysfunction merely by the validation of what is, of what we can change, and of what we must accept. Validation takes away the chaos, the shame, the confusion, and the bewilderment. Thus, we hope that this program validates the survivors of abuse, both young and old, as well as provides the means for intervention and support.
Hello. The program you're about to view concerns an issue that affects our families, communities, businesses, and even threatens our very lives. It's called domestic or intimate relationship violence. Domestic and relationship violence doesn't discriminate. It doesn't care where you live or where you work, and it doesn't care about your socioeconomic status, age, sex, or race. Domestic violence may happen in any relationship, and before you know it, you're in a spiraling downturn which seemingly has no end. This type of violence is usually against women, but men are victims of domestic violence as well. The statistics show us that nearly 1/3 of American women will experience domestic violence or intimate partner violence in their lifetimes. Domestic violence is the leading cause of female homicides and injury-related deaths during a woman's pregnancy. Studies show us that anywhere from 3.3 to 10 million children witness some form of domestic violence annually. This program is intended to educate you on the signs of domestic violence, to share statistics related to domestic violence, and to provide our audience with community resources to receive confidential support services. We also hope the program will provide our community with the needed confidence to break the silence, report, and take action against domestic violence. First, let's put some perspective on this issue and look at national statistics that show us what domestic violence is doing to our communities. Annually, 3 million women are physically abused by their husbands or boyfriends. In 2001, more than 500,000 American women were victims of non-fatal violence committed by an intimate partner. Men accounted for approximately 15% of the domestic violence victims. An average of 3 women are murdered by their husbands or boyfriends in this country every day. Health-related costs of rape, physical assault, stalking, and homicide committed by intimate partners exceed $5.8 billion annually. In our businesses and organizations, domestic violence is estimated to cost nearly $728 million in lost productivity, with over 7.9 million workdays lost each year. Our group of experts is going to help us understand this issue as we ask the question, is domestic violence happening in our neighborhoods?
We may have a picture in our minds of who is affected by domestic violence. I must stress that domestic violence does not know any barriers of culture or nationality, race, creed, or color, socioeconomic level, neighborhood, rural, or urban area. Domestic violence is everywhere. Unfortunately, domestic violence remains a grossly underreported crime. Most victims do not tell the police, and the majority of those injured never seek professional medical treatment. Despite the violence of some attacks, despite the escalating violence with each new incident, and despite the injuries received, some victims still will not report. This is where we all are called upon to get involved, to be aware, and to take a stand. I'm not advocating personal intervention. I am saying you should know the signs of domestic violence, then call the police. So it falls upon us in the community to be aware, to take a stand, and to break the silence about domestic violence.
Yes, domestic violence can happen anywhere, at any time. It's a subject we avoid discussing, but we must break the silence.
I think the great tragedy of domestic violence is that it can happen to anyone. I certainly never expected to be a person who would be as intimately knowledgeable or involved with domestic violence as I came to be. I have a sister, Lisa, who a few days from today would have been 52 years old. Unfortunately, however, and very sadly, her life ended as a result of domestic violence.
But how can we predict whether a person with whom we're involved is or will be physically or emotionally abusive? There are some behavioral signs you need to be aware of. The more signs a person possesses, the more likely that person will take part in abusive behaviors.
Oftentimes, battered women are very surprised that this escalation or this abuse is occurring. When they go back and they trace their relationship with the individual, it's often very romantic. He's very kind. He, the word soulmate is often used. They had an immediate connection. She felt that he was different. And so when this behavior changes, it's very confusing. And many times battered women spend a great deal of time trying to figure this out so that they can get back to this initial honeymoon stage, if you will, and get back to being with this person that they met. A huge warning sign in domestic violence relationships is that they happen very rapidly. Most relationships, they're in a committed relationship, they're living together, they have a child, or they're married in 6 months or under a year. And there's no accident why that occurs. He can usually only maintain this facade of behavior for a short period of time. And so after he feels that he has her in a committed way, his behavior begins to change and he starts to put more demands on her. She starts to see escalation of his behavior, whether it's name calling, perhaps it's throwing something at the wall but not actually making physical contact with her. I think it's important to clarify that the women that are in these relationships are incredibly bright women. I think that the stereotype is that there's a certain type of woman or the woman is not educated. They're very bright women. If on the first date he pulled her from the car by her hair and assaulted her, she wouldn't be back with him. This is a really systematic type of relationship, and it's very methodical. It happens over a period of time, and the batter is pacing himself slowly as he's getting closer to her and kind of disassembling her support system, isolating her. Perhaps she's not spending as much time with family and friends. He's gaining more control of her. Then the systematic abuse starts. But it's usually not an overnight thing. It's a systematic, purposeful type of abuse.
Other signs to be aware of include the following: unpredictable mood swings, blaming others for his or her problems, hypersensitivity, jealousy and possessiveness, verbal abuse, controlling behavior, isolation from friends and family, cruelty to animals or children, playful use of force in sexual conduct, past battering, threats of violence to you or others, breaking or hitting objects, any physical force during an argument, drug and/or alcohol abuse.
Our firefighter paramedics often respond to incidents involving domestic violence, whether it be day or night, in the workplace or in the home, and regardless of the demographics within our community, these incidents occur more frequently than you would think. Oftentimes, alcohol and drugs are contributing factors.
Our program here is designed to address substance abuse and domestic violence, two separate interventions, so that we are going to the root cause and looking at the control issues associated with the violence, but that we're also addressing the addictive components of substance abuse. Substance abuse does not cause domestic violence. It does oftentimes escalate the abuse, but it is not the cause or the precursor for why violence occurs. Violence in and of itself occurs separately. If you stop the alcoholic from drinking, he will still be a batterer. There are many alcoholics that never have put their hand on another person. So we know, without a doubt that they are not, they're two separate issues. One does not cause the other.
These behavioral signs should not be taken lightly. Abusive behavior tends to get more severe as time goes on. The ultimate goal of any abuser is to dominate and control you. Again, the more signs your partner possesses, the greater the chance that you may get hurt.
One would think that abusers would not continually go from abusive relationship to abusive relationship, but the literature seems to suggest that that's in fact what happens. That certainly was the case with my sister Lisa. She tended to go from one bad relationship to the next. Ultimately, of course, that cost her her life. My sister was a substance abuser herself. Many of her domestic partners were substance abusers as well. I personally tend to believe that there is a interrelatedness between substance abuse and domestic violence. It seems that they often are present hand in hand. And for example, on the evening that my sister was killed, she and her domestic partner had engaged in extensive substance abuse, as they often did. They became involved in an argument and got in a fight, again, as they often did. This particular evening, however, ended tragically with him taking a gun and shooting my sister and then leaving her alone to die as he left the scene to try to cover up the crime.
Why does domestic violence exist? Many feel it's a behavior that's passed from parent to child and continues generation after generation. Children grow up thinking that domestic violence is an accepted behavior in relationships. Crime and incarceration of youth are often associated with a history of child abuse and exposure to domestic violence. Can there really be a link between this exposure and crime?
Millions of children are exposed to domestic violence each year. Children exposed to domestic violence often suffer psychological and behavioral difficulties that, if left untreated, can severely impact their lives and may ultimately result in perpetuating an intergenerational cycle of violence. Children live in 80% of the homes where domestic violence occurs. 75% of the time, children actually witness the violence. According to this study, boys exposed to domestic violence committed by the father are 10 times more likely than boys from non-violent homes to use violence against an intimate partner in the future. Domestic violence calls are some of the most violent and dangerous calls requiring a police response. Alcohol, drugs, weapons, and physical attack are one or more of the components in most calls. The worst case of domestic violence I investigated tragically involved the murder of a pregnant mother, murder of her 3 children, and the suicide of the father. The growth of community policing philosophies and progressive police policies require police officers responding to domestic situations to investigate if children witnessed the event or were exposed to violence. We in law enforcement are frequently the first professionals with an opportunity to interview or make referrals. We must protect the children and help eliminate the cycle of violence.
We have found that children that grow up in a relationship where their parents or their loved ones are being a victim of domestic violence, they grow up to either, one, be a victim of domestic violence, they find that it's acceptable behavior, or two, they grow up to be a batterer. What happens is the children grow up in this relationship and they see it frequently and they really don't know any better. And we tell victims in our cases that we see that, you know, your child is growing up with this environment, and children don't have choices how they grow up. And obviously adults do, but a child exposed to it has a greater chance of being a victim or being a batterer in their lifetime.
Well, generational domestic violence, of course, continues, but I want to preface that by domestic violence is always a choice. You are not predisposed because you came from a domestic violence home to become a batterer or a victim. You can make choices as you grow up into adulthood and make changes. We continue to explore what happens to children that come from violent homes, and yet study after study tells us that children that are exposed to violence in movies or violence in video games are desensitized from the world that they live in. They learn that the world that they live in is not safe. And there's a bit of an oxymoron, if you will, because what we also continue to perpetrate is, but he's a good dad. And I would mention that I find it hard to believe that you can be a good dad if you're beating their mom. Those children are part of mom and they're part of dad, and so that child lives in fear of what will happen to them at any moment. What oftentimes also happens is that the child begins to align themselves with what they perceive as power. And if dad is ruling the home, if dad is the boss, if you will, that child is going to align themselves with dad, because if they align themselves with mom, they're going to be afraid that something's going to happen to them. These are kids that may have been up all night listening to mom and dad fight, that may have been kind of shoot off to school in the morning and, you know, left their home seeing their mom bleeding or with a black eye, and they're sitting in school trying to concentrate or learn, and they don't know what they're going to come home to. So those kids live in a minefield, if you will. There is no stability, there is no safety, and they learn the rule quickly that what happens in our home stays in our home. And so it feels almost a betrayal, if you will, to go outside of their home, to speak to a teacher or a social worker, or to call the police, because that's often associated with making things more complex for the family, maybe making it more difficult for mom. So they feel very helpless, and especially for male boys, growing up in an environment where they feel helpless and they can't protect their mom has them stifling a lot of feelings that become oftentimes harming to themselves and others as they grow into early adolescence. You'll see children, oftentimes adolescent males, getting into it with their dad, trying to protect their mom, wanting to make their dad pay for what he did for a lot of years. So it's not hard to imagine why living in a violent situation would be very difficult for children, developmentally and emotionally.
My mother, for example, never spoke of the abuse that she received. She thought it was best to keep the family unit together, as dysfunctional as it seemed to be. And despite the negative behaviors that were shown towards both her and to myself and my siblings, she chose to keep the marriage together and the family together because she believed that was what was best. And I think that was prevalent in the culture at the time in which I was a young person growing up.
Breaking the generational cycle of abuse or getting involved in assisting someone who is a victim seems easy enough, but the statistics show us something very different. Estimates tell us that about 30% of Americans know of someone who has been physically abused in the past year. 40% of girls aged 14 to 17 report knowing someone in their age group who has been hit or beaten by a boyfriend. The question is, was anything done to help the victim?
Every case that we have, somebody knows that the victim is being beaten. So neighbors know, the family knows, their clergy knows, their coworkers know. And why aren't they getting involved, and why aren't they doing something to help this victim? Well, a lot of victims actually fear reprisal. If a neighbor or their best friend or their mother goes to the police and reports it, the victim has fear that because now the police are involved, that the batterer is going to retaliate and it's going to be worse. A lot of batterers will actually say, if you ever tell anybody, I will kill you, or I will kill your pet, I will kill your mother, and we've had defendants actually carry out those threats. So a lot of people have, it's hard to get involved. A lot of people think it's a personal matter, it's a family matter, but why don't people get involved? I think that's a great question. I would like more people to get involved and try to help these people, because friends don't let friends commit domestic violence, and friends shouldn't let their friends be a victim of domestic violence.
I know that part of the cycle of silence is because people feel ashamed to make acknowledgments and to make expressions about substance abuse that may exist among members of their family, acts of violence that they may witness or that may occur within their own family unit. I can only tell you this: it's simply more important to acknowledge the realities and to seek assistance, prevention, and treatment than it is to maintain the silence. Maintaining the silence, in short, just doesn't work. Things such as substance abuse and domestic violence will not cure themselves. Intervention, treatment, and prevention, I think, are the keys. There are such resources that are available today for people who find themselves in the circumstance of substance abuse or domestic violence.
Know what to do when you are faced with a partner who is going to commit violence against you or who already has committed this violence. You must have a safety plan for you and or your children.
As a psychologist, one of the things that I work diligently with battered women on doing is pointing out that at the point where you're needing to create a safety plan, what you're saying is, I'm not safe in my own home. And so for those of you that have not been exposed to domestic violence, imagine that for battered women, home is the most volatile, unsafe place in their life. The point of a safety plan is to assist women in communicating appropriately with their children, that should a fight occur, should they hear loud voices, should they feel unsafe, that they know what to do. And that can be from something as small as the children knowing where a hiding place is in their home, where they can go and be safe until the fighting stops. It can be having a cell phone in a special location because dad might pull the phone out of the wall and they can't call 911. Might be leaving a back light on so that if the neighbor sees that, they know to call 911. Oftentimes it's encouraging mom to keep all important documents in a safe location so that if she needs to flee immediately, she has access to birth certificates, immunization charts, child records. It's preparing for the worst. So much like we did with 9/11, that's what people that live in domestic violence do all the time. They're preparing for the worst and trying to be safe under those circumstances.
All research says that the most dangerous time for a victim is when that victim is leaving. And when I first heard that statement, I kind of wondered about it, and I did the research from the Oakland County Prosecutor's Office, and over half the murders that I prosecuted, the victim was trying to leave the defendant. So ultimately, the victim had either said they were going to file for divorce, filed for divorce, was about to break up with the defendant, and they ultimately end up being killed.
Your next step? Getting the resources you need to keep safe. Here's a list of organizations that can assist you.
One thing that's very important to break the cycle in domestic violence is it takes a community. A victim can't do it by themselves. Domestic violence, I like to say, is a very strange and ugly beast, and it's not something that should be tolerated. But what I always tell the victims that I see, knowledge is power. And we have books that we give them. We encourage victims to tell a trusted member, tell somebody, call Haven, call a local shelter.
You know, I can say that having worked in this field for about 20 years, I've watched domestic violence grow from something that was a private matter in their home to something that is now a public matter, something that we as communities address in what is often called a coordinated community approach, which means that hospitals get involved, police get involved, EMS get involved, not-for-profit, battered women's shelters. We just run the gamut, and obviously the court system. And so what I think what we've grown to do in our community is say that domestic violence is not okay. It's not all right for you to batter or abuse your wife or significant other, and that we continue to work to make a stand about this being a crime and not tolerable.
The statistics are overwhelming, and you are not alone in your struggle. In Michigan, between October 2003 and September 2004, domestic violence organizations received over 55,000 crisis calls. That's an average of 151 crisis calls per day. These Michigan programs provided residential and non-residential services to almost 57,000 women and children during this time period.
We, at the prosecutor's office, there are 5 full-time prosecutors that are prosecuting solely domestic violence felonies. To say we're so busy is an understatement. There are so many felonies going on, not to mention, of course, the misdemeanors, but the felonies include when it's an assault with a weapon, when you assault someone with intent to do great bodily harm, there's attempt murder, obviously there's manslaughters, second-degree murders, first-degree murders, there's all kinds of criminal sexual contacts, and as well as there's home invasions and aggravated stalkings.
Conservatively, 1 in 3 homes experiences domestic violence. And so if you look through your neighborhood, that's a lot. Obviously, you're not alone. And it takes a risk and it takes courage to talk with someone about it. But you can always make the first step. You can come to a clinic, you can call a shelter, you can talk to a friend and begin that process, because your life will not change until you address what's going on. You can't call it something else. You can't pretend it's something different. People don't have that type of relationship in every home. And so what you're kind of calling a normal fight is not a normal fight. If you're afraid to go home, that is not normal. And it's not normal for your children to live in that environment. And the cost to them in terms of human development, the cost to you as a woman, the cost to the man that's perpetrating is priceless. You're not living the life that you want. And so to take that first step, there are resources everywhere. You need to be courageous, but people do it all the time. And you're already courageous if you're living in an environment like that. Working through it, talking to someone, getting help is a much easier option than what you're going through on a day-to-day basis.
Make sure you really understand the behavioral patterns of abusive individuals and realize there are organizations within our community that are there to assist you during this troubling time.
One of the most important messages that our department can deliver to the public is the importance of reporting domestic violence and also seeking medical attention when you're the victim of domestic violence.
Call somebody. You aren't alone. You don't need to go through this by yourself. Just because you call and report it doesn't necessarily mean they're going to do time. There's counseling, there's the batterers program, there's substance abuse treatment, there's mental health treatment that the defendant could get. These are all for the defendant. You're not alone. You shouldn't be going through this. It's not normal behavior. It's not okay. Batterers don't treat their dogs this way. So you can get help. The defendant, the batterer, can get help as well, so that you can stop living your life walking on eggshells and be safe. You deserve to be safe.
I think that, loving relationships can certainly help people overcome their dysfunctional childhoods, and people need to make a commitment to behavior, to form a family environment in which they can be happy and satisfied and productive, and in which they can provide a proper environment for their own families. And although there is a tendency for substance abuse and domestic violence to be cyclical and generational, there is hope, and I'm very proud to say that Carol and I have been able to create over 33 years almost of marriage, a very loving relationship and a very warm and encouraging relationship and environment for our children.
At any point you can change your life, and it may not make sense. You may be adding up dollars and pennies. You may be trying to figure out custody. I've watched more women leave a situation and not figure out all those little components, say, I don't want to live like this anymore. I deserve to be treated better. I deserve to wake up in the morning and feel good, and so do my kids, and I deserve to feel safe. And I've watched women time and time again leave those situations and go on to have amazing lives. And I'm just constantly awestruck by the resilience of victims. I've certainly worked with amazing men that have made changes, that have made amends, that have gone on to lead nonviolent lives. And so change is just but a phone call away. Change is but what you can put into place at any time. So you never have to live like this. Life can be better for you. And so there are a lot of resources in the community if you want to take that first step. And I know that people can make change and live great lives because I've watched it for 20 years. So I feel hopeful that we continue to tackle this issue as a community. I feel hopeful that we tackle this issue as clinicians. And I think that one day we will live in a world where this is just not even a discussion. Maybe one day I will work myself out of a job.
There is hope. There is help, and you do not have to suffer alone. On behalf of the Farmington Hills Call to Action Coalition, we thank you for your time and action.